Hello, everyone. Today we will have another episode of OSS Power-Ups, and today we're going to talk about bUnit with the great Egil and Steven, who are both maintainers of the program. But first things first, just to give you some pointers here, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. And I think I also need to... I got my stream here running as well. Okay, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them either in YouTube chat or Twitch. We will try to address them as we go. Also, if you have to drop out for any reason, feel free to continue watching a bit later because this is going to be recorded automatically. So whenever you have time, then you can continue. But otherwise, this is great if you just stick around, ask your questions, and we have some fun together. To give you a brief introduction, we always do that in this kind of format about why did we came up with OSS Power-Ups. So generally speaking, about open source in the .NET community, I think it's fair to say that organizations largely benefit from open source projects with various frameworks actually and tools that are out there. But the contributions back are rather insufficient. I think most maintainers would probably agree with that. And as a consequence, sustainability can be seen as a large issue for all these projects. And also maintainers are at risk. Yeah, I think if you follow social media, then you recently probably heard about a particular event, but we won't go into detail because it would be too much for this stream here. But yeah, what we thought at JetBrains was we want to power up some .NET open source projects. Part of that is that we sponsor them for a full year with $100 per month. We would also like to share our strengths in various, areas. That could be profiling, graphics, CI/CD builds, and plugins. I think we've seen examples of profiling and plugins so far, not so much about graphics and CI actually. And we also want to give a platform, to raise awareness about this problem that I just talked about, but also about the project itself, so that maybe you feel inspired to help in any way with time, with funds, whatever that might be. So today is Wednesday, but I will make it the throwback Wednesday, actually. So last time we had Angle Sharp with Florian. We actually have a full site for these power-ups. So if you want to watch some of the previous events that we had. And back then, we also promised to look into profiling. I just have to say, Florian is such a great developer. We didn't find anything. I was sitting down with Martin, but no chance. Yeah, everything was already on a very, very high standard, I should say. But Angle Sharp is actually a very good segue into our today's guests, which are Egil and Steven. And I will bring both of you to the stream now. And also let me hide my screen for a moment. So yeah, hi you two. Nice to see you. Nice to have you here.
Hey. Hello.
Hello, so, nice to see you.
Egil is a .NET developer from Reykjavik, Iceland. Steven, right? Yeah. Steven
Correct,
is
yes.
also .NET engineer from Zurich,
Yes,
working at
exactly.
and Egil working at Delegate, I think. Yeah, right. Nice.
Delegate, correct, yes.
Nice company name, by the way. That's a funny one. All right, nice to have you here. I'm very thankful that you can spare the time. And you both are the creators of bUnit, and so you're also very big in the Blazor, let's say, community. I'm wondering, Egil, you said before you're actually not using Blazor that much on a daily basis, right? But still, you're kind of a maintainer.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I started bUnit back. Was it 4 years ago or something by now? Yeah, I was toying around with Blazor, but I'm mostly a backend developer at work. So no, not a lot of front-end Blazor stuff, unfortunately. But hopefully that will change in the future. You never know.
I do think so. I had the opportunity to work for multiple Blazor server projects, and it's very nice. So fingers crossed, it will come.
I think I think I should say, Egil, you're very lucky actually to get someone as a co-maintainer for this project, because not every project is in that position. I think it can help quite a bit. I really have to say
I was really happy when Steven sort of decided to come in with a few PRs and issues, and he did he did a really good job. So I quickly asked if he wanted to hang around and become a maintainer as well. So yeah, it's nice to have somebody to throw ideas around with, and so it helps a lot. It makes the tediousness, some of the tediousness, go away from maintaining open source, definitely, to have somebody to do it with. So absolutely, yeah, it's been fantastic having Steven. Is it 2 years now or something like that, Steven?
I think so, yeah, I think so. Like roughly 2 years ago, I started with basically, so I looked for a project on my own, Blazor-wise, because at least in Zurich or in Switzerland, industry-wise, it's not much. So I decided, I want to have my own blog for reasons unknown. I just wanted to have that. And obviously you want to write tests. And then I came to bUnit because it's de facto the standard you would use. I don't think there wasn't anything out there like 2020 or even 2021. There wasn't much out there. And at some point, I don't know, it started with how those things normally start. Or you have a bug, and then you go to the repository, you file it, and then you're like, oh, they do this nice. The code is very well maintained. It was super easy, even though it's quite of a complex story. It was very easy to dive into the code and try to get an understanding what's going on. And from there on, yeah, here we are.
Yeah.
I think what Egil said also is a very good point about throwing ideas. I think that's a problem that many open source projects have, because they only have a sole maintainer, and just bouncing those things back and forth and seeing if an idea survives under certain circumstances is already of great help. And I could also see that some of your issues are marked with needs info and all that stuff. So also for everyone that's consuming one or another open source projects, then make sure to watch those issues sometimes. And many times it's just great to get some feedback, on some ideas.
We do have more issues than we have time, but thankfully most of our issues, I don't think we actually have a single bug issue right now. Maybe one that's been surviving for a couple of years, and that's just due to how the whole solution is structured. We can't really fix that until V2 at least. But so no, it's mostly a bunch of good ideas and a lack of time to actually do anything about them for the most part in our project. So that's a nice thing at least. But yeah, as you say, it would be awesome if people are using bUnit to come in and share their thoughts and provide input. And we'd love to, if people have specific ways, things that they think are hard to do, come in and tell us about it. So that might be an easy fix for us, and then slight adjustment to APIs or new APIs we can add that will make a certain scenario much easier. So that's super welcome. So by all means.
Yeah. Egil, I have one thing before we dive into the presentation. I know from another stream on your right-hand side, that's a Quake picture, right? Other side, yeah. So you're the first one that I meet in the developer community that played Quake 3, and I would love if we play one-on-one sometime. That would be super cool.
Oh, it's been so long, but yeah, definitely, I'll be up for a beating. That would be fun.
Yeah. That would be super cool. And it's such a long time ago. Yeah, I missed that. I haven't been much of a gamer since then, but Quake was one great thing. All right. I also see plenty of comments already in the chat. So it's always interesting, that. Please let us know from where you're tuning in. That's good to hear. But otherwise, I think who wants to start with their slides? I think it's Egil, right?
Yeah, I think I'll kick us off, and then I'll let Steven do a bunch of live demos and take us through the basic concepts that we have.
Okay, can I add your stream?
Yeah, go ahead and add my screen. It's just 2 slides, so it should be pretty quickly through with that. So yeah, so before we get going, thanks everybody for tuning in, and so Steven and I kind of assume that Blazor and about unit testing concepts. Otherwise, we can't start with that. So that's sort of assumed. But so I think the first question we want to address is what is bUnit and why do we need it? And so the concept is like bUnit is a library for testing Blazor components, but the sort of the main point is it's a library. It's not a general testing framework like xUnit or NUnit or MS Test that you might be using to test other things in your applications. So bUnit is something you add on top of those frameworks like your Fluent assertions or your mock or your nsubstitute or other libraries that you use to help you test things or enable testing scenarios. So that also means that bUnit, when you're writing tests using bUnit, they fit nicely into whatever ecosystem you've decided on, whatever testing frameworks you have. So it'll work and look and behave sort of similar to what you're already doing. It's just, some APIs that allow you to do stuff with the Blazor components and render them and assert against them and so on and so forth. So you can keep using your existing, whatever organization practices, best practices you have in your organization, you can keep using those and you can keep doing what you're doing. You just add bUnit on top of that. So it should sort of seamlessly fit nicely into what you already have set up. And when we talk about testing UI components or front-end testing, typically the test approach has been to run things in a browser and sort of automate a browser, doing a headless thing with maybe with Playwright or Telerik Test Studio or Selenium, and so those kind of testing tools. But bUnit doesn't do that. bUnit doesn't run in the browser. It runs entirely in C#. So that also means that it doesn't run your JavaScript like you would if you, for example, are trying to test a Blazor application with something like Playwright. That has some advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, if you have a lot of JavaScript code in your application, that JavaScript code will not be tested together with your C# and code or operator code, Blazor code. But one of the advantages is that we can, because we have deep hooks into the Blazor runtime, we can make your tests super predictable, super fast, and they basically behave and run like regular unit tests. And they become much more easily debuggable, for example. So there's some advantages and disadvantages to that. And with that, so let's talk about so that is sort of what bUnit gives you, but why do we even need it? So the problem with just testing a Blazor component, and a Blazor component at the end of the day is just a C# class. It's just a class that in theory you can just new up and you can do stuff with it. But because components, they have lifecycle methods that we have to basically treat them in a specific way, or rather in the way that the Blazor runtimes will treat the Blazor components. So we have to sort of invoke and handle the lifecycle methods in the same way that the Blazor runtime will. We also have to pass in parameters and services and other things that is being passed by the Blazor runtime into the component at the right time in the right way to emulate or to sort of mimic a real production environment. Otherwise, it's going to be a less useful test. Other things, we have to interact with our components. The components, they have event handlers, for example, so that you go click a button and the button click triggers an event handler in your Blazor code. And again, we need to do that using something that does it in the same way that the Blazor runtime does it. And maybe I think the more important point is that components, they don't really produce markup. So the markup that gets rendered out to a browser and displayed to the user, the Blazor component itself doesn't actually produce that. That is something that is decoupled from the Blazor component itself. It's the Blazor renderer that takes care of that. So we need to have a bridge if we want to assert or test what markup our component will be producing when we're testing it. So basically, all of sort of these four main pillars are what bUnit really provides for you. It builds on top of the Blazor runtime. We haven't re-implemented the Blazor runtime. We are using the Blazor runtime, but the Blazor runtime is nicely designed to be extendable so that we can redirect, the output from the Blazor runtime into something that you can work with during testing. And with that, I'll let Steven show you guys, if you can share Steven's screen instead, show you guys how we actually do all of that with bUnit.
Perfect. Thank you, Egil. Yeah, also, again, welcome from my side. Really excited to show you some stuff around. Maybe, as you can already see, this is some Blazor code. So this is my favorite framework and my favorite IDE. I'm using JetBrains here. And you might see this is your typical hello world in Blazor. It's this beautiful counterexample. I do think a lot of you know already how this looks like, but for the sake of it, this is it. You have a counter, you can click on it and it increases the number. There's a lot of magic. That's
Mind-blowing.
Mind-blowing, yeah. I don't know if React can do that, but Blazor for sure can. So basically what I created here is your everyday WASM template. So if you just go and create a new project in WebAssembly, this is what you get. Fancy, but also not so exciting. And what do we want to do now? Well, we want to have a test project because, as Egil said, this is just your everyday unit testing. So we are leveraging your unit test framework, and then we do some stuff with that. So let's do that. I will just create one new project. This will be a unit test project. You can use whatever you want. So we support NUnit, MSTest, xUnit. That's really up to you. My personal preference is xUnit, but please, that's really up to you. It's your choice. Also, how you call your tests. Yeah, I just call it tests.
I do have a brief question, if I may.
Yes.
Do you have special support for those? I mean, do you have to write any integration with those frameworks? Because one other thing that comes to mind would be SpecFlow, for instance. Would that also work just like so? Or
no, not at all. There's no special things. It's literally just a NuGet library you download, and if you can even run it from a console application, bUnit that is. So any testing library that supports running something, running code from somewhere else can work with bUnit. In reality, we just highlight the free test projects in our documentation, and because that is what most people use. But I think there's also some more esoteric testing frameworks out there that should work completely fine with bUnit.
So to make it work, there are basically three things involved. So what you see here is just a CS project file of the template I created for xUnit. You can see xUnit here. You see .NET SDK. You see some coverlet collector. Nice, beautiful. Obviously, we have to reference our project, our production code project. So that's this one. And yeah, obviously, what we also need, we need bUnit. So how do we do this? Yes, you guess it. It's just a NuGet package, so we can just use this. It's called bUnit. As you can see, there's also a very nice auto-completion, even with all the versions, but I will take the latest stable. Not that the preview is not stable. I'm pretty certain it is, but Okay. And one thing which might seem surprising, what I will do in literally 10 seconds. Seems weird what I'm doing, but I will guide you through why I'm doing certain things. If we go on top, you see here project SDK. So basically this gives you a subset of certain things which your assembly already has. And there's one thing you can do which makes your test feel more natural. What do I mean with that? You can say that your test is a Razor library. That seems odd, but stick with me for a second, because your production library or your production code is basically also Razor code. So why not writing your tests in Razor code? And to do so, you have to basically tell .NET or MS Build, hey, I have Razor files here, and those Razor files somehow have to be translated to C# file. And if you just annotate this with .razor, you're doing exactly that. And this is also our preferred or our recommendation to you. If you write tests, write them in Razor syntax. And there are a lot of reasons or a lot of simplifications you have. And you will see in a second the syntax. It's way easier if you do this in Razor than in plain C#. But obviously, you can do both. It's a matter of what you prefer more.
Yeah, and it doesn't really affect your, if you have an existing unit testing library where you maybe are testing some business logic that is also targeting your production code, it doesn't break that by changing the SDK type to Microsoft.net.SDK.Razor. So your xUnit test will work completely as they do normally. This is just enabling basically the Razor compiler to do its thing, as Steven said.
Yes. And another thing, obviously, I went here through and showed you very technical stuff in the CS project file, but we got you covered. There is a bUnit template, so you can just use this. And then we set up everything for you. You don't have to do this manually, but it's cool to show how the internals work when you create something. So there you go. Okay, then let's create our first test. And how does that look? Yeah, here you can see I will create a Blazor component and not a C# file. I will call it counter tests because this is mainly what I'm testing now, the counter component. So this one here. And the obvious candidate for testing here is I click the button and the counter is incremented by 1. How would we do this? Well, let's remove this code here for the time being. I want to have bUnit. So as you can see, I'm writing Razor code. Instead of using namespace, I use the add notation, which is typical for Razor. I have bUnit, and here comes the magic. We inherit from a certain class. We call it test context. And that thing, as you can see now, it highlights that it comes from bUnit. Almost 99% of all the magic we're doing and all the utility you can get is coming from that class. So our preferred way is always try to inherit from that, but there are also other ways. At the end of this talk, I can show you in the documentation. We showcase those things because obviously there are edge cases where you can't do such things, and there we got you covered as well. Now here in the code block, this is regular C#. Like in the counter here is regular C#. It's also here regular C#. And what we do, okay, I'm using xUnit, so I have to call it fact, and then I can say, okay, public void click on counter will increase by 1, something like that. Don't call me out on naming. I'm horrible at that. We know that developers are in general not great with that, and I know exemption from that. Okay, now we basically have 3 things in almost every unit test, and this is we have to arrange something, we have to act on something, and then we have to assert on something. Arranging is a bit like what you would do in a real end-to-end test, that you say, okay, I want to have my component or my website. In this case, you want to have your component, in our case, the counter, and you want to render that thing. So we have a method called render. And now here's the beauty of the Razor syntax. You can literally write something like that. So here's the counter. You can see this comes from my production code, and then I have this counter inside. Here that's missing. I have to add the using, and then we are good to go. Power-ups, that's its pages. Exactly, and then you can see also the auto completion tells me that thing, if I click on it, I'm back to my counter. And this is very, very, very convenient. As you might imagine, your components can have parameters and can have other things, which I will showcase in a few minutes. And you basically write the same thing as a parent component would with this counter. It's literally the same notation. So your mental model stays in the same world. You don't have to write different things. That's why we prefer to stay in the Razor syntax, because it feels more naturally what you already wrote. Okay, then we render something. That render thing returns us an element. We call this always like cut for component under test. A lot of people call their service under test. So this is a component, so it's cut. And then we have to act. Acting means I want to click that button. And I guess a lot of you are familiar how end-to-end test framework work, like Playwright, Cypress, and whatnot. And the normal way of achieving things in such frameworks is you take a CSS selector and then you act on that selector. And bUnit is no different than that. So we have our component, and then we have a find method. And the find method, if I just hover here, you see it wants to have a CSS selector. So my component is pretty straightforward. It has just, I want to click that button, so I get the button. Let's get me that button. And then I want to click. You can see there's a click, there's even a double click. So all the events you might have on your Blazor components, you can emulate here. So this would translate one-to-one click to on click. But obviously you can have so many events like on input, on mouse down, on mouse up, on key up, on, you know what I mean. So these are, I guess, 99.9% of the times have the same name. So if it's on click, the method you have to call is click. And that will click that button. So the only thing we have to do now is we have to assert that basically our counter was increased by 1. And we do the same thing. We want to get basically this P element here. So let's do the same as we did with the button. I want to have a P element. That's that. There's only one. That's why the CSS selector will only basically hit one element. And then we have here a MarkupMatches method. So that tells you, okay, the markup should match my expected string, if you want to say so. And also here, the cool thing is you can use the same notation as before. So you can say here, I want to have a P element, which has a certain role. And now my current count should be 1. That's literally rolled status. I even wrote it correct. Isn't that amazing? And then I just run all my tests. That should be compilable. First time right, as always. You can see.
Roll, please.
Yeah. Yes. As you can see here, the counter test I wrote here, the first unit test one is from the default. I could have also deleted that. But as you can see here, that thing is done. It was green. The expectation was met. 2 things.
Just for fun, can you just break the test? Just like maybe do current count 0.
Okay.
Just to I don't trust tests I haven't seen fail. So
yeah, I was about to say the same.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, that's fair enough. Any other input I should take? Obviously, we could MarkupMatches is hard coded to return true if a certain string is read, but obviously,
yeah, exactly.
Just kidding.
So if you want to show the error message that we give,
exactly,
so
fair point.
Can...
So here it tells you that an error was found. It also shows you the tree where it looks like, and it's like, okay, the actual one. So this is the one your component, this counter component gives you, shows current count 1, but your expectation was 10. This is what I wrote in here. And yes, if I go back to 1. Execute that test once more, it's green again. Perfect. And to emphasize one thing when we're talking about unit tests or end-to-end tests, one thing is always speed. And as you can see, this one takes 330 milliseconds. That's blazingly fast. If you take it just into relation of end-to-end tests versus unit tests. And you might argue, okay, that's still pretty slow. Well, yes and no, because I can show you something. If I copy paste that test, I call it 2 because why not? Why not? And I run all the tests in that suite. You can see there are multiple tests. You can see that still the runtime didn't really increase much. It's only the first test because of what we're using here. We have to initialize some certain stuff. The Blazor renderer has to initialize some certain stuff. So the first test is slow, relatively speaking, but the rest is fast. So even if you have like 20, 30 tests, or you make theory tests where you want to have a wide range of input, it's still fast. Okay.
I do have a couple of questions, actually. I was thinking about asking that before already, but even now I don't know if it fits, and maybe you come back to that. So just let me know. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh man. So you mentioned earlier that bUnit doesn't take JavaScript into account, doesn't run it. When do you, or when would you say does it make sense to use bUnit? Every time that my code doesn't involve JavaScript, or would you still use it for, or is it more like regular unit tests where you say it makes sense, or full pages, or yeah?
So it depends. So, for example, the Blazor team. Well, so let's take an extreme example. The Blazor team, the guys that are actually building Blazor, they use, I think they still use Selenium, but I think they're migrating to Playwright. They're not using bUnit, and it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because they have 2 main components in their solution. They have the C# bits, and then they have the JavaScript bits. And there is a tight dependency between those, and it's not just like a few lines of JavaScript they have. It's like 1,000 plus lines of JavaScript. So there's lots of logic that needs to be worked together correctly with the C# bits, where we're sending render tree diffs to the JavaScript that does updating. So they kind of need that tight integration testing. If you just have a Blazor component that has a little bit of JavaScript, maybe it's calling something. Like calling a single method, or calling I don't know, one of the service APIs in the DOM, maybe like blob storage or something. I guess not blob storage, but then generally in Blazor apps you have very little JavaScript going on, and if you have anything, it's mostly just some thin wrappers around some APIs in the browser that you want to call. You don't have. Generally, the promise with Blazor is that you don't have your business logic. You don't have any real logic you want to test in JavaScript at that in your Blazor components. So in that case, you can still lean on bUnit, and bUnit actually comes with a specifically built mocking framework for the JavaScript interrupt where you can say, I actually expect this JavaScript call to happen during my test, and you can verify that. So we don't run your JavaScript, but we can verify that you called the method that you intend to call in JavaScript. Obviously, if you have super complex JavaScript, like the Blazor people have, or if you do something else where you have a lot of complexity in your JavaScript, then you might want to test that. And that is where you sort of typically like you go into more of like an end-to-end testing scenario, integration testing, where it makes sense to use a playwright or something else to do that end-to-end testing if you have a lot of stuff going on there. Could also be that you're building a Blazor application and not individual component or component library, and you want to test sort of end-to-end scenarios where you can open up the application and you can go through a login flow where you contact third-party providers like OAuth providers and come back in and you're logged in and you can go through a bunch of different pages. That is typically something that bUnit isn't ideal to. bUnit really shines if you're building component libraries, and I know the guys, for example, like Blazor and Blazorize, they use bUnit heavily to test their components because they want to make sure that the individual component works correctly and they don't have regression between their releases, so that us, the users of their component libraries, we don't have any breaking changes when we are upgrading their components, upgrading our component library dependencies, for example. So I hope that sort of, I can't give a clear definition. So it kind of depends on how much JavaScript you have going on and the complexity of that.
Yeah. So every time, let's say, a JavaScript, some piece of JavaScript code has a rather small contract, let's say, then it makes sense to mock that out for the really great benefit of having to run for being able to run this in a very short time. And I think even, I'm not a front-end developer or web developer, but those tests here, I think, can also easily be run in parallel. Web tests usually not, right? Yeah. Okay.
Well, maybe. I'm not an expert, but yeah, you could definitely run. These are just regular C# tests, so they will run in isolation completely fine.
Yeah. I mean, if I would create two classes with separate test contexts, they run literally in parallel, yes.
Something that Egil mentioned in the backroom chat is the project template. I'll paste the link for that. So that will... Now the question is, that has a parameter to choose the underlying test framework, I guess, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Right.
It works with the .NET new in the command line, and I guess Writer will integrate with that and pick out the options that we can ask for in the command line, similar to, and Visual Studio does the same thing. So it's just a standard .NET project template that we publish that way.
Gotcha. So we had one question here. If we include Microsoft Razor, the SDK for the project file, that should not give any issues with the other testing projects. I guess that's
ideally
no problems.
Exactly. Ideally, your test projects anyway are in isolation. You shouldn't have a big dependency graph between your tests. You might have like test utilities and stuff, but your real unit tests at the end, they should be ideally independent of external factors. But
if you have regular unit tests in there that are not written in Blazor files or testing other parts of your application code, maybe services or something you have in your Blazor application that is just regular C# classes, then they'll continue to work fine. It just enables a few more things, like that example right there.
Exactly. So we can also, just as an example, we can write the same test I did earlier as Razor syntax. I can just use plain old C#, so to speak. The functions are sometimes a bit differently named, but the idea is still the same. So I still have my component under test. I have a method called render component. I would put in my counter here. And from there on, it's almost the same. I have my button. Oh, by the way, I saw someone ask what happens if we have multiple buttons in here. If you use find, there's a find and there's a find all. Basically, find will always take the first one it finds, or throws an exception if there's none available. So if you have basically multiple selectors which would fit here, then it just takes the first from top to bottom. So you can work with IDs, with classes, with test IDs. There are a lot of ways where you can come around that fact. Yes, actually here, and then you can continue talking. I just write.
Yeah. So and while so actually just a throwback to your AngelSharp we mentioned before. We're actually using AngelSharp in bUnit. So when you're using find, we have the rendered markup represented as a document object model via angle sharp. And when you're using find, you're actually using angle sharp to search through the document hierarchy, the nodes, and returning that. And actually find will return an inode from angle sharp. So we have a deep integration with angle sharp, and I've actually created for angle sharp. I created the sub library called angle sharp diffing, which is what we're using when you're calling markup matches. It's a semantic comparer for HTML. So we sort of giving back and helping out in angle sharp as well. So that's a good collaboration between us and Florian. So it's a nice coincidence that he's been on just before us.
I scheduled it just for that reason, because I thought it's nice. I needed that, segue. I do have a question about this assertion. Now, you can tell me if that what I say makes no sense, but my unit testing mind would say, can I also just test the content of the paragraph?
Yes.
So without the role status, etc.
Exactly. So that's a very, very good point. I will briefly come in a minute or two. I will come why we have this function, because it seems tedious, but your way will also work. So that's the cool thing, because we are using angle sharp. You can basically use all the properties angle sharp is giving you, because what bUnit is doing is we have the representation of the DOM is done in angle sharp. So you can use the I elements. You have typed buttons, you have like iHTML element button, I guess it's called, stuff like that. So we just build on top of that. And yes, you can just use the text content. Now I don't have any cool
You can actually use markup matches on top of text content just. So
is it equal?
You mean assert equal? Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you want to do something like that, you can also just pass in current status, or you could use markup matches if you have some weird white space things.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I have white spaces. We were talking about this with Florian actually in the last episode. Yeah, that's can be a tricky case.
Yeah.
Exactly. So maybe this is why it's a good segue to why do we have this markup matches method in the first place. And the simple reason is let's just go to the counter. Now it's literally one-to-one the same string. You can see here, obviously, the variable is substituted by the real value, but besides from that, the formatting and everything else is totally the same. But it doesn't have to be, because you can also do stuff like that, and it's valid. And from a semantic point of view, it's still the same thing. It didn't change anything, because white space at the beginning and at the end and even in between, they don't matter.
You can add a couple of white spaces between current and count, for example. And in the browser, when users view that code, it will look the same. So from what we had 1 minute ago, and now it will look the same. So, but if you run the test, you will see that it actually fails now, and it fails on the assert equals, but not on the markup matches. So that is where markup matches really shines. That is the angle sharp diffing library that I built for bUnit and added to angle sharp, that understands HTML semantics and understands that these two HTML strings are semantically the same. Like this string we have here on line 18 and the one that we have in the counter razor file are semantically the same. They will work and look the same. So, and there's a whole bunch of other things it understands. It understands if you have multiple attributes, the order of attributes doesn't matter in HTML. So there's a whole bunch of things that. So historically, it's been a problem if you want to actually assert against a sort of raw markup with assert equals, for example. That is something you generally avoid in front-end testing, because it's basically just a refactor or reformat of your document away from breaking all your tests. But with markup matches and the semantic comparer we have built in there, you don't have that problem. So you are free to semantically reformat your HTML or razor files and not break your tests. And that's super valuable if it's important to you that the structure of the HTML you're generating is in a certain way. So I hope that makes sense.
Good. I will just, for the sake of it, return it to a state where it's a bit better readable for everyone.
It's not horrendous. Yeah.
Yeah. I get anxious if I just see how the white spaces are spread around. Anyway, I just saw a question in the chat, and I guess we can pick up from here. And I saw like, how do you deal with cascading parameters, for example? And we can basically generalize that because we don't necessarily distinguish much between cascading parameters and parameters. Yes, there are some bits and tricks you can do in bUnit, but in general, they are parameters. From your point of view or from the component's point of view, they're just parameters. So we can just refactor that code so that this current count is a public parameter, which an outside component or the parent can set. So how we do this? Well, normally it's a parameter, and that thing should be public. It should also be, hopefully, property. And then almost our code is good. So if I do this and do this, everything is almost the same. I mean, from the component's point of view, I just changed to have a public API. But from the test point of view, nothing will change. So if I run that test again, oops, sorry, that test again, it still works. And why shouldn't it work? I can change anything from a business point of view or logic point of view. So the test is still green. How do we do parameters? One way, and that's why this Razor syntax is so good, is you just see here the current count. I just pressed space and you can see, okay, there is a value. I can just set whatever I want, for example, 6. Obviously, if I add 1 to 6, it's not 1 anymore, but as you like red tests, I will let that thing fail.
Yes, please. Red tests. We have to remember our red-green refactor, otherwise we're cheating.
Test-driven development. The test-driven development says here current count is 7, but expected is 1. Well, yeah, then obviously what developers do, just change the expected in the test. I'm just kidding, of course. No one does that in real life. And the test is green. Yeah. And Egil, yeah.
So there was a question about cascading parameters. So in here, if you want to pass in a cascading parameter, you could either set it directly if we have a cascading parameter, or you can just do like you would in regular Razor. You could wrap it in a cascading what's it called? Cascading value.
Cascading value.
Yeah. So you just you can just write. Yeah, just try to write it out, Stephen. And then we have to obviously move the component on the test inside there. And yeah, maybe fix the formatting slightly. But so you can just pass cascading values in like that. So it works in the same way as you would write it if you're just reducing the component in your
Exactly.
I hope that answered the question from, I forgot the name of the person, but yeah, good question.
I saw also a different question about what should you basically test. And I would say like the general rule of thumb is if you have obviously like business logic inside, which is worth testing, you have to test that. You could argue technical concerns, but I would not. I would rather not. It should be like some business concerns, and obviously concerns which you can also observe from the outside. You might be tempted just to go in because it's a normal C# class to go in and grab some public properties or even reflection and whatnot, what you can do, but don't do that. Try to focus on what would a user see, what the browser see if you change something. That is observable, and that's worth testing. I guess it's a bit hard to have a like hard line where you say like this is worth testing and this isn't anymore. It's more like a gray area.
It depends kind of question as always, right? So I would say if you have business logic, or not business logic, rather maybe component logic. Business logic hopefully kind of exists somewhere, not in a Blazor component, but somewhere to the side of that. But if you have component logic, maybe component logic that controls, I don't know, how a wizard goes from one step to the next step, or validation rules, or all sorts of other things like that, that is important, then you should write a test for that. But it's like if you have a C# class with a property, with a getter and a setter, and no business logic behind the getter and the setter, it's going to be kind of redundant to explicitly test that properties getter and setter because it's just generated. It's just a standard property. There's no value in it. So don't necessarily chase 100% code coverage. But if there is business logic that you want to ensure continues to work, then by all means test it.
Yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Steven, you do a good job about picking the questions.
Yeah. With my
otherwise it's always tricky about to know when to interrupt people and then ask the question. But I will do just that right now. One thing I do want to mention that as part of this, power-ups for bUnit, we were also looking at an extension or plugin for writer and resharper. Interestingly, Egil mentioned that Jimmy Engström, I don't know how to pronounce the last name.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, good. Is creating something for Visual Studio so that you can switch between or create bUnit tests from the component that you're actually writing already. It's super interesting that in Resharper we brought a feature that kind of, gives some way to actually work on that. So just today I was sitting down with the guy who's maintaining unit tests in Resharper and Writer from our side, and I think we can also provide a similar thing. So a good idea also from Jimmy, by the way. A second thing that I was wondering, and I think I would bring this also in the plugin if we release one, the conversion to a parameter, like Steven, what you did manually basically with the field, to have some alt enter way and say this should be now, instead of a field, should be a property and should be marked with parameter. That would also be a nice addition. I'm actually surprised that we don't have that just yet, or we just don't know it. That could also be. So is there something?
You have no.
Just on alt enter, no.
Yeah.
No
refactors.
So yeah, but would be a good thing to add actually.
I suspect that Blazor is going to be even more popular now with .NET 8 and the ability to write Razor, have it be usable not as a Blazor application as such, but more as instead of using Razor pages, you can use Razor components with .NET 8 and as well. So there's going to be a lot more use cases for it. So it'll be awesome if there's even more tooling around that in Writer as well.
I just want to pick up one question I saw regarding, just to complete the picture about the cascading parameters. Someone also asked, how would you do the same thing in C# code? And there are multiple ways. I guess the easiest, let's go in.
Well, actually in C# code, you just pass in the parameter. You can show how we pass in the parameter for, so you have to do pp parameters and then .p.
And then you have another one. Here's the current count. So you would get it here. Normally, your cascading parameter would also pop up here because it's just a public property, and then you can set it to whatever you want.
Yeah,
I hope it's still.
It's a bit hard to read with all those helper.
With the inline help.
With the inlay hints, they're a bit annoying in this case. Yeah.
So when you want to pass parameters using just in regular C# code, you can see that we have sort of a parameter builder kind of pattern where you can go in and specifically select, I want it for the current count, I want to pass in this value, and it will make sure that it's that we validate that it's the right type of value you pass into that parameter. So in this case, it's going to be an integer. We don't allow you to pass in a JSON object or something, right? So you can sort of build it up like that, but it quickly becomes a bit more convoluted if you have multiple parameters, especially child content or nested parameters. But what you can do, you can go to the bUnit.dev website, and you can go and you can actually see the parsing parameters and cascading values up over to the left there. And if you scroll down a little bit, Steven, you can sort of see we show both variants. So you have a sort of tab so you can switch between the C# version and the Razor version. So here you can see how we would render a component that has 2 parameters and how we can pass in values to that using C# code. And if you switch over to the Razor version, you can see how it looks in Razor code. So you can pick the one that you think, matches your temperament the best. So we like the Razor version because when you have a bit more many more parameters, especially child content based parameters, then it becomes a bit easier to pass that in Razor code. But typically, the editor experience is better in C# code. There's just more refactorings available and help us around you writing a C# code in a C# file versus in a Razor file, because Razor files are super complex. Like you can have everything in there basically. So it's reasonable. But so yeah, we have both options.
Okay, about the refactoring possibilities, I'm not too sure, to be honest. You mentioned those are a bit better on the in the real C# version.
Yeah, in the C# file.
But if you rename a parameter, let's say in the Razor test code version, wouldn't that also propagate, for instance? That should also work, right?
If you go into the counter component and do a refactor on the public parameter in there, yeah, some maybe that will depends on, I don't know. We can go back to the Razor file and see if it picks up that obviously in the C# file because it's just C#. In here, it also did. But there's other things like, code refactorings that doesn't necessarily work, even though you're in a code block there in C#. At least that is how it is in Visual Studio. I don't know how it is in Writer for this, because it might actually work just as well in Writer. But yeah, but you can go both directions.
Theoretically, there's also nothing stopping you from putting C# test code and Razor test code side by side in a single project, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like here. Basically here, unit, it's a horrible name, I'm very sorry, but this one is a regular C# test. It's the same test as the initial one I wrote, and then you have this Razor file. From the compiler's point of view, there's no difference because Razor files are just C# files. They look a bit, you can see this by the way here, it now becomes really ugly, but was it here? No.
It's under analyzers actually. So basically the Razor compiler is an analyzer that will take your Razor file and convert and generate a C# file for you. You will have to actually force it to generate. You can go into the bin folder to find them.
I wanted to have the source generated file. That's one really cool thing about Writer, that you have them here. You can just go and you can see that, for example, here the counter, it's ugly. There's a lot of compiler stuff around, but at the end of the day, it's just C#. And yes, there are things here. There's some weird render tree builder, but at the end, it's just C#. You could, in theory, write this code on your own, and the result would be the same. But obviously, no one does that for good reasons.
Yeah. So yeah, that is what Razor files get turned into, and the same thing with our test code. I guess you should be able to see the source generated file for the test, but I guess maybe you need to reload because you changed the SDK type. So maybe it hasn't picked up on that. Yeah.
But I guess it's also not so important right now.
No.
I would normally I would argue, okay, we can look how event callbacks are done. We can look how child components or child render fragments are done. But I would skip that part for 2 reasons. The first reason is the documentation, again, bUnit.dev shows literally everything. It shows you how to inject services. Basically, it's your default ASP.NET Core DI container. So you can, how you would
just click on the link and show one example. Yeah,
exactly. So you have this weather forecast service, which is the default you have. So if you create this template I showed you earlier, that you have this also, and you can see here we just add this service here and we just create one. You can create also your own implementation. You can use mocking or stubbing libraries, whatever you want. That's obviously working. And this is a good segue to what I want to pick up in the last minutes if there are no other questions. And this is the whole topic of stubbing, because we allow you to stub whole components completely out if you want. And in the recent light of mock and other things, I also want to show you how you can provide your own fakes. Maybe you don't want to refactor your code in 2 years because some maintainer decides, okay, it's now time to add something you don't like. So why not doing this on your own? Because it's not that complicated. So what I'm doing right now is I have this current count here. Let's call it, what did I do? Okay, I guess my writer crashed right now. I don't know how I did this, but let's force quit that for once, because that's pretty easy to do.
We have it on the stream. We can try to reproduce afterwards.
Ah, nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
So
always scary when somebody's using your software. I remember
Yeah.
when I started building bUnit and some people started picking it up and using it on Twitch streams. And I was like sitting and, no, don't do that, don't do that. And you can only scream so loud in chat. So that's it's a very humbling experience having people use your stuff in public. Go ahead, sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, no. So what I wanted to do is basically, now imagine this now is a button. It's your button. You wrote that code, but this could also be like Egil initially mentioned. Normally, or oftentimes, you use third-party libraries, and you don't want to deal with third-party libraries necessarily. So what I will do is I will emulate or simulate a third-party library in the sense of I will just create a button. We call it now increment button because that's literally what it does. It increments something. Just copy paste that. So this is the button I had before. It has a click event, and that's all. Okay, fair enough. Let's go back to this component. I don't want to use that. I want to use my cool increment button. And this increment button has also this click event, and there I just go to increment count and call that. From a outside point of view, from a public point of view, so your browser, your client, nothing changed. The behavior is still the same. I just refactored some internal structures. That's fine. So if I run my code down here in the counter test, let's run them both. They're still doing what they should do. You can see they're green. And it's fine. But imagine increment button has a version bump from 0.1 to 0.2. And the maintainer decided I don't like buttons. I'm using Bootstrap. That will be a div. Why not? It can be a div. It can be an ahref. It can be anything. You don't know. That's not under your control. That's now where I'm going to, because that's the problem. Now, nothing in your logic changed. You did nothing else. You just upgraded the NuGet package. But as soon as I press here, that unit tests, this thing will fail, both of them. And the reason I make this a bit bigger is no one found an element that matches the selector button. Obviously, because there is no button around anymore.
I think the key point here is you have a test that is testing the counter component. Should a test for the counter component fail if an implementation detail of a child component, maybe a child component you gotten from a third party somewhere on the internet, has changed? And probably the answer is no. So go ahead, Stephen.
Perfect. Very good. So what bUnit offers you to circumnavigate that is we completely either remove elements in the DOM tree or replace them. Either replace them with a mock or with your own fake. So let's do that with your own version. We call it right now component factories. And there we have a lot of things like add stub, and add stub doesn't do any, add stub's primary concern is remove whatever is in here. So I could completely remove that button from the DOM tree. It's not completely removed. There's an empty stub, but obviously that will not help you here at all, mainly because you still need something to trigger that button. So what you would need here in this case, you would need your own component, and you can build your own components. The only thing you have to be aware of is the public API, the circus. So in this case, the event callback with its name and its parameter types, they have to be the same. That's all. I'm not sure, I guess we can't enforce that. It's a runtime error. So this will not pop up during compile time or design time. This will pop up during runtime. Let's make this a bit smaller because you don't need to see this right now. I can also completely remove it for the time being. Let's remove this test. This was anyway not use something. And what we can do is we can just create my own fake incremental button. Yeah, well, whatever you want. The only thing, it has to be iComponent. That's basic. Every Blazor component has to be an iComponent something. But normally, if you create Razor files, what the compiler does for you, it creates a component base. And I basically, when I create those things, I always use component base. And now, as I said, the public API surface has to be the same. So I will just be very, very lazy and just copy paste this code directly here. And here, instead of add stub, because again, that will just create an empty shell, and we need something to do here, we use a replacement. And the first parameter is what do I want to replace? And the second parameter is the replacement itself. So that would be my fake incremental button. And here again, if I rename this somehow, you don't get the compiler error. So you have to make sure that these types, the public API surface, matches. Once this is done,
and you can argue that that is actually a positive thing, because that is if you're using a third-party library, if they change their public surface of their components you're using, you kind of want your things to start failing, right? So it's part of the public contract, the assumptions that you have with the library you're using. Their implementation details, that's not your concern, but the external public surface of the API is your concern.
Yeah. Now what we can do is, instead of using the find button, because that thing doesn't exist anymore, we can look for those fake components. And also here we have this cut, and we have a find component, and that works like find. If you call that thing, it looks for the first entry, which somehow fulfills your requirement. My requirement here is I want to have a stub, so a test double of this fake incremental button, because that's what we are adding to the DOM tree, or to the render tree, if you want to say so. So here's my button or stub button. I don't know how to call that perfectly. And you will see now a very long line of code. But don't worry, we are currently in the midst of making this a bit easier. This will be very long, but it will be only one line of code in a few hours, I hope, days. Let's see. Because what we want to do now is I want to invoke that click event, because still my counter is somehow attached to that thing. And now it's a bit technical here.
You actually want to find the component that is the fake. It's not a stub anymore, because you're not stubbing it out. You're just passing in your own version. So that's a neat thing that we can do in Blazor. Blazor is loosely typed in terms of the component tree. So as long as we have two components that look the same, like doc typing, we can replace one component with another component. It just needs to have the same public properties, and then we can just replace one with another.
Yeah. And now it becomes a bit. Yeah, stick with me for a second. I will explain you what's going on. Let's make it async task, because this is something which is awaitable. And this test we can then now run. You have it down here. We have our two tests. One doesn't exist anymore. And you can see it's still green. But if you want, you can also add here 8 or whatever to see that it's failing. Sorry, I did make it green directly and didn't wait until it's failing.
It was red already, so you're good.
Oh,
you're good.
Fair.
Yeah.
So here there might be a bit magic involved. What is going on here? Basically, we have two threads competing against each other. We have your xUnit test, or NUnit or MS test, that runs from the xUnit runner, or MS test runner, or NUnit runner. So there's a process which picks up your tests and executes them. And that's in its own little thread. And then we have Blazor. And the Blazor renderer, which tries to be, at least for WebAssembly, let's see how long this takes, is very sequential. So there's only one thread involved. They have something called synchronization context, which you have to use. So basically, it's like, if you know WPF, you're not allowed to write on the UI if you're on a not on the main thread. And the same thing applies to Blazor and bUnit.
And you can actually say it's people are probably used to that. If you do something, sometimes in a Blazor component, it will say you are not. Maybe you have some callback from JavaScript or something else, and it will tell you, hey, you're trying to call a method in your Blazor component, but it's not in the right. It's not running under the dispatcher, so you have to call it inside invoke async, which is essentially what we're doing here.
Yeah, exactly. So this is sometimes a bit tedious also with the stubs, but we're trying to flatten things out to make it a bit the experience a bit smoother. Yeah. So here it's very, very easy to write your own fakes when you have to act on them. But sometimes, and that's oftentimes way easier. Just imagine your button here has some imaginary component, like the page title. It's a bad example, but just imagine the page title has no business logic for you, but it needs JavaScript, it needs certain setup. Then you can just say, okay, I don't care, that thing is annoying, and just remove that thing so I don't have to set this up. So, and then the page title would be gone. And the funny thing is, and I can show, yeah.
Stephen, go ahead and just step back and on line 21, explain what is going on in there so people understand why you go to stop-button.instance.clicked. What are you actually doing there?
That's a good point. Okay, so find component, as you can see here, it returns you some interface of your fake incremental button. So what bUnit is doing is bUnit has a wrapper around your component because we have to keep track of certain things. We want to perform certain actions on that button. So that is why you have here these rendered component. I hope it's visible in the stream. Then invoke async. Egil, you explained it perfectly. That's already covered. And the instance is basically you access really the instance. That means the real newed up object, your fake incremental button, the one which is really used in your render tree. And there you have everything which is here, which is publicly available. So if I add a public int a, obviously I would have this a here. So that is really that thing. And that's why you use instant and then invoke async is just the method from the event callback to trigger your event so that the parent components can listen to changes.
Yeah. So what we're essentially doing here, and we want to make this a bit more smooth, but the idea is instead of going in and using find to find the specific element in the third-party component and invoking the handler that is bound to that, which will then invoke the clicked event callback that you are listening to, that you actually care about, we just replace the increment button, which is maybe third-party, with your own fake implementation of that, and you just have the public property called clicked, which also exists in the original one, and your component, the counter component, will pass in an event callback to that. And what we're doing is we're just taking whatever your counter component passed into the child component, and we're invoking that directly. So we are sort of taking out all of the other stuff, implementation details from the third-party component, taking that out of the picture. So as long as the public contract stays the same, everything should, keep going. But yeah, we want to make that even easier to do. It's a bit tedious, and there's some ideas for that.
Exactly.
Quick question, or probably an assumption. So on line 20, that find component, that's not really limited, I guess, right, to just fake components.
No.
So I could also use that with any regular components that are in some way nested,
yes.
right?
Yes,
it's a good question. We have sort of two representation. We have the markup document object model representation, HTML you generated. That is sort of a tree in itself, and then we have the component tree. So from cut, you can always call find component or find components plural, and you can search through the component tree down and find child components as well, and interact with them, and do stuff with them.
Was it just for me that sound was interrupted, or?
I don't know.
Yes, I heard everything perfectly.
Okay, then it was just me. And second thing is, I'm just dreaming a bit here about extension and all, but the fake incremental button. So in your case, you just copy pasted that. I think that would also be a nice integration, right? Like if you if fake incremental button wasn't existing, for instance, and you added there on line 15 to have some, alt enter generate quick fix, let's say, that basically copies the whole public interface of the left generic parameter.
Yes. So one thing we have been thinking about, which would be to basically use source generators. So we could on the fly generate, replacements for that thing. That's because we can inspect. Yeah, and you could also do it with a code editor experience. You could also, Stephen, if you still have that code sample you showed me where we use the stub instead, if you don't want to create fakes all the time. But it's the line 21 becomes a slightly longer if you do that. So we do have a sort of the stop of, like we do up on line 16, add stop of some page title.
And also quickly, if you want.
Oh yeah, I can just show maybe my... Yeah, but basically we want to have a way for you to just go and say, I want to have a stop of something. I want to stop something out, and it should just be something that receives all the parameters that are being passed to the component I'm stopping out, but then being able to access that component. So in this case, this is one thing we are proposing.
Can you zoom in a bit, maybe?
So this is kind of the same thing. In this particular example, we are stopping out something called an input text, but it could also be the incremental button. They're rendering a component that uses that component, and then we're going to find the stop component. And here we would then have something called invoke event callback, where we use this lambda to select the actual event callback. And the event callback would be value changed in this particular case, and we pass in a new value to that. And then that would have the same effect. So that is one option we are investigating to make it easier to do this kind of thing. So yeah, now you guys are also seeing sort of the bleeding edge new ideas we're struggling with. So yeah, and if anybody has any ideas or experience with doing source generation or other things, that's an issue related to this that you can come in and provide some input for us if you have any input related to this.
So in this case, you get completely rid of the fake increment of a separate type.
Yeah.
Basically,
that
you
is
have
in
to
bUnit,
name in your own codes.
Exactly, that is in bUnit built in sort of a stop type of component that you can use in many cases. In this particular example, we don't. You want to stop out the increment button, not fake increment button.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And also find the button.
No. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's here.
And I think you need to have reference using. You might be missing a using statement.
Didn't I call it increment?
I'm just thinking.
Yeah, increment button. I should use.
There you go.
Proper.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Then we have parameters get here, and you can see that becomes very, very long. Just to make it work. And you can see that that's even not.
But that does work though. That also works. So you don't have to create the fake increment button. You can do something like that. But it's a bit long-winded, but it does work as well. So if you have a lot of components you want to stop out, go ahead.
Sorry. By the way, Stephen, maybe I'm not sure what the default settings are, but for those inlay hints, you can also configure them to be only shown on push. It's called push to hint. So then you hold a button down, and only then those inlay hints are shown. I like that way more. You get the insight only when you. Yeah, it's called inlay.
I will look it up afterwards, but that's a good point because I would prefer this even. I mean, because often at times I cannot decide, and sometimes it's cool, and sometimes it's in your way, and obviously the IDE cannot decide when it's good and when it's not. So perfect, yeah.
There are a ton of options for that actually, but yeah, I made it push to hint for myself.
Perfect.
It reminds me a bit of TeamSpeak, also the one that I use in my Quake times. Push to talk, yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
So, but about. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No. If you're finished, then please go ahead, because I would continue with something else.
About the source generator, I think probably one of the challenges is to generate only a single type that is reused across different files. Probably
the idea could be, if you see, for example, you have add stub, then you have this increment button. You could, in theory, so I played around this afternoon with this. You could create a stub of so you have a strongly typed one, increment button, which goes from that, or they call it like that. It doesn't matter, which comes from that, and then you return this, and then you implement everything. There's a lot of things we can do. The other option is you dynamically create extension methods on top of this type. So these are the two types I fiddled around with source generators this afternoon. Well, it was not. Yeah, it generated something. Let's call it like that. It generated code. But there are so many edge cases you have to be aware of, especially also with parameters, cascading parameters. So I just skimmed through the public API and wanted basically to have the complete public API available with source generators, and also namespaces you have to be aware of. And there's a lot of things which at the surface it seems pretty straightforward. And then it took me 20 minutes to feel like, okay, there's a lot of things I have to take care of if I really want to go down the rabbit hole. But in theory, there are a lot of approaches you can go here.
I had a mistake thinking about this. So source generators, they're not per file or anything, but per compilation. But anyway, I'm
exactly.
I'm just imagining if I saw Stefan was writing at the very beginning. I'm just imagining him. Oh, did someone say source generators? So maybe even he's interested. We had him on the stream as well before.
Nice.
Not sure if it was about Roslyn, but yeah. But that looks really interesting, that issue. I think I'm going to check it out as well.
That would be really cool, because I really struggled after a while with that. Exactly. The last thing I want to show you, and this is for me one of the main features and which distinguishes basically bUnit to end-to-end tests, besides the obviously blazingly fast runtime, and that's how you can debug your code. Because with end-to-end tests, yes, you have like Cypress where you can stop, you can like inspect certain elements, but it's really tricky. And that's the cool thing, because you have components oftentimes in isolation. Even if you have bigger components, you can just attach the debugger and you can print out the markup. And that is, so I just go here, press right click, debug. And then we can see, okay, my debugger literally stops at my act, and then I can do whatever I want. So,
and even more important, you can set breakpoints into your component that you're testing. So one of the things,
also,
especially if you're writing Blazor WebAssembly, it has sometimes it's hit and miss whether or not you can get a debugger test out in the browser and so on and so forth. So if you want to debug your component, probably the easiest way to do that consistently is with bUnit. You don't even have to write an assertion if you don't want to. You can just write, render a component with some parameters you want, and then you can go and set debugs. You can go set breakpoints in your editor directly. So
I know this is a bit small, but you can see here the H1, the counter, the P element, and the current count. So we can even see the rendered markup. And what we also can see is both elements I basically stubbed out. They're really gone from the markup. So the HTML is really cleared from those elements. And that's really, for me, one of the strong points where end-to-end testing falls short pretty quickly. Exactly. Yeah. I could also go in that component, as Egil said. Like I make now
put a breakpoint into the increment, for example. Put a breakpoint in there.
This one. That's perfect. Exactly. This will be invoked in a second. So I go here, and you can see I'm in, and that's perfect. The debuggability is very, very nice. And yeah, also on our backlog for the future, already implemented. But let's see when we release it. More inline hints and other things to make it even easier for you to see what's going on. But yeah, let's see. Perfect, and I can run this test. No, I didn't run the test. I run that thing again. Exactly. Are there right now any questions?
No questions, but Stefan responded. Said that is indeed accurately describing his feelings right now about the source generator. I muted myself. I do have one last question, but please tell me if it doesn't fit within the last, let's say, 10 minutes. Could we maybe have an example where you have this JavaScript replace?
Of course.
Replacement? Would that work?
Yes.
So I'm quite interested in that.
So we can make a dump example, which goes really, really quickly. So this is Injector. This is how you get your services into the component. I take the JS runtime, call it JS runtime. And now I just make a simple, here, I know it doesn't make any sense, but I will put it in here. We'll say, hey.
Just do a eval or something. Console log. Just write something to the console every time.
Exactly. Alert, the famous alert debugging. Exactly, console log. I don't even have to use any.
I just pass in some text just for fun.
Okay. For you said for fun, so I put in for fun, obviously. So what happens now is if we, that's also something very, very nice. If we run now that code, it will basically fail. So let me run that code. Make it a bit bigger here. No. That's my fault. Obviously, I stubbed everything out, and then obviously it doesn't work anymore.
No, we don't have actually. We removed the JavaScript. Yeah. So remove the stubs. Just remove the stubs and go back to what you had. I think actually I might have a test below still.
Yeah,
that's you have it as test 2. You can just delete the test 1. So that'll have all.
No, I deleted.
Oh,
unfortunately the whole thing.
Just do the find button and then click and so on and so forth. Did we lose Steve? Oh, he's sitting very still.
It seems so. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if he does in a couple of seconds. So let me just explain what's going on. Basically, the IJS runtime is the Blazor abstraction for. Hey, Stephen.
Hey. That's funny. Everything worked. I tried the multiple websites in the background. They all loaded, but StreamYard decided not to work.
Oh, good to have you back. I was about to explain what JS interrupt is, but you can just take it from here.
Yeah, let me just quickly put this again to a button, that makes it easier to understand what's really going on. And I click that button, click, and now let's go. And now I'm a bit confused. Why is green?
I think it's green because you're calling it after.
You're right.
Yeah. So you could also we could just put it into, exactly.
We make it real.
Yes.
We make it a real thing.
You don't want to do a throw and find forget thing. So.
Exactly. Then you can see bUnit notices you have some JavaScript interrupt going on. You can see it here, but it is not configured to handle the call. So in the world of mocks, you would call it strict mode. There's strict and loose mode, and the default is strict. But the cool thing is it also tells you what to do. So you can see here, hey, I discovered invoke void async, and somehow you didn't do anything, but you can just simply do either this or this, and then it's working. So if I go in and say
the explicit one, I guess.
Yeah, I like the explicit one more. I take the JS interrupt, and there I have this setup void, and then I can say, hey, console log. I could have also copy pasted it for fun. Yep.
So what we're essentially doing here is we're doing the same thing here would you do with MOQ or in substitute or something else. We have a mock, but we have it specifically built so it understands how the JS interrupt works in .NET. And now it's complaining because the increment is probably wrong. Yeah.
No, I changed also stuff around here.
Yeah.
But not that part changes anymore.
No. So what you can also do is with the setup void, it returns mock setup that you can then verify again. So you can also, now we've set it up so that basically we tell it to, hey, handle this call when you see that call, and we don't really care about it. But we can also assert that the call happened, and we can assert how many times it happened, and so on and so forth. So you can basically, similar to if you're building, I guess maybe something that is calling an external web service, right? And you're just unit testing that. So you maybe have an abstraction or you're using HTTP client or something like that, but you don't want to include the call to that, external service in your tests. You just want to replace that, stop that out, or mock that out so that you can assert that you did the call, but not that you don't actually have the call actually happen. So this is the same thing. You kind of have to treat IJS runtime and JS interrupt in your Blazor component as if you're doing a network call. And actually, if you're doing Blazor server, you are essentially doing a network call. It is calling over the network wire down to the browser and doing that, calling that JavaScript. So it's sort of the same mindset you have to go into there.
I have to say it. I also like this framework design that you're actually printing what is needed. Yeah, I don't remember who said that, but about throwing meaningful exceptions or exception messages also. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, I think we even need to maybe improve on that in some places if we can. But it's super nice that if we can avoid having, even though we have fairly nice documentation on our website, I think it's nice if people don't have to leave their editor to go and fix a problem. So.
All right. Should we wrap up?
I guess from my side,
I think so. Yeah.
My last words are just thank you first for all the attendance. And the second thing is I can just only repeat. Here you find our really beautiful written documentation. It covers a lot of like 80% of cases are covered. And the rest, just click on that button and you come directly to us, and then you can do whatever you want. You can go to the discussion. If you want to have a general discussion, you can see there's a lot going on. There's already a lot of topics are covered. If you think you encountered a bug or you think you need a new feature, just go to the issue tab and just tell us what you want. That's obviously something we for sure need to know how bUnit is used.
Stephen,
Really
there's
good
an
point,
issue
Stephen.
you haven't read yet.
Yeah,
Oh, it's actually new. 1 hour ago.
Yeah, an hour ago. Race edition.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
sounds good. That sounds like the
I'm
real
surpri-
fun ones.
I'm surprised the bUnit dev website is not written with Blazor. So you're using docfx, or actually, I should say I'm surprised docfx was not ported to Blazor in some way. Maybe that.
Well, Blazor is really not well. At least when I was writing that, maybe with .NET 8 you could do that in Blazor, but Blazor isn't for static content, which is this essentially is. That's just a waste of resources.
Yeah,
this is
also,
just so don't get.
also
So
true.
yeah. Yeah, but yeah, I was contemplating it when I did set that up, but no, this is just markdown files, converted into HTML by docfx.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus, it gives you this nice API reference, which is really nice, though.
So, but Matthias and the rest of team over at JetBrains, it's super awesome you're doing this, supporting open source. I think it's fantastic to see companies like you guys leading by example and showing how that's actually supposed to be done, and helping us small timers, open source developers. So big kudos for doing that. It's really nice. And
Thanks.
Actually, I really appreciate also you offering your time to do some memory pressure testing or other things, because mostly actually time is almost more valuable than the otherwise generous donations you are giving us. So it's can't praise you enough for that.
Yeah, we talked about this before, and I can just say, I mean, everyone at our team enjoys it. Martin also, I'm not sure if you read that about the profiling stuff. We did that 2 times now. Unfortunately, only 1 time we really found some stuff. Like I mentioned, not so much with Angle Sharp. That was
if Martin
too perfect
is bored,
already.
he's very welcome to come and profile our code. That would be fun.
But I must say I'm really hyped about checking out that source code generator.
Nice.
I would definitely ping Stefan right here right after. If he's got some time to actually look into that, because that sounds really very powerful, to get going more quickly. I mean, it's a manual task otherwise, creating those mocks, and it's like the perfect case for a source generator. Yeah, but also appreciate your words. I also like I also love that I can lead this little format here, and it's really a lot of fun also. Today as well, I really have to say that was really nice with the 2 of you. I will also switch over to my screen. So if you want more information, we are also dropping our personal URLs here. So for JetBrains Writer, lots of things that you've seen today is from Writer. But also do check out the bUnit project. Give it a star. I think that should be the least for all the great work that you did. Very thankful also in the name of the community, of course. I haven't done so much with Blazor. I have 1 talk, but I even had bUnit in there, and I have to say I was using the C# test code approach, and I will definitely update to the Razor approach, because back then I think back then it was the first version that I saw, about the C#. Or I just haven't seen the other one. Yeah. Shame on me.
Well, we have just recently started presenting that as the default option that we suggest people use, because historically the editor experience in IDEs, and maybe especially Visual Studio, was pretty bad in But when you went from HTML markup language into code language and then into markup language again, when you try to reformat the document, everything would go haywire. So it's fairly stable now and a good experience. So
that explains things.
Yeah.
All right, very, very cool. Again, thank you two for your time. It was awesome to have you here. And thanks, of course, everyone else for joining, for all the questions. We had great audience today with lots of questions, and I hope, at least I saw one comment where someone was saying, where was it? I will start using it right away from today.
Nice.
Yeah, I hope a lot of other people feel that way. And yeah, thank you all, and tune in the next time, and we'll see you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.